Hey folks, before the video starts, please leave a like and subscribe to cheer me up. Make sure you are relaxed and enjoy today's stories. I played the cursed Minion game on the dark web. Alright, so I know this is going to sound absolutely insane, but just hear me out. It all started a few weeks ago. I'm just an average guy, 26, working a dead-end job in IT support, living in a small apartment by myself. I'm into gaming, and sometimes when I'm really bored, I delve into the darker corners of the internet just to see what's out there. Not the smartest idea, I know, but curiosity gets the better of me sometimes. One Friday night, after a particularly rough week, I was just browsing through some forums and stumbled upon a thread discussing a game that supposedly only existed on the dark web. It was called Minion's Curse, or something like that. The thread was filled with comments about how disturbing it was, how it ruined people's lives, and how no one should ever play it. Naturally, that piqued my interest. I mean, I played some pretty messed up games before, but nothing that could ruin my life. So, I decided to look for it. After a couple of hours of searching through shady websites and forums, I finally found a link. It was buried deep within a page that looked like it hadn't been updated in years. The download link was simply labeled, "Play with caution." I should have taken that as a sign to stop, but instead, I clicked on it. The download itself was surprisingly quick. It came as a zip file named miniongame.zip. I extracted the files and found a single executable named minion.x. The icon was just a black square with a faint, almost imperceptible red symbol in the center. Against my better judgment, I double-clicked it. The screen went black for a few seconds before a simple menu appeared. The title Minion's Curse was written in what looked like blood, dripping down the screen. There were no options, no settings, just a button that said Start. I clicked Start, and the screen faded to black again. When it came back, I was in a dark room with stone walls like a dungeon. The graphics were surprisingly good, very realistic, which made it even creepier. There was no background music, just the sound of dripping water and my character's footsteps echoing as I moved around. After a few minutes of exploring, I found a door. As I opened it, the screen flashed, and I was suddenly transported to what looked like a suburban house. It was night outside, and the house was eerily quiet. The only light came from a few dim lamps scattered around the rooms. I wandered through the house, and that's when things started to get really weird. The pictures on the walls looked strangely familiar. As I examined them closer, I realized they were pictures of me. Some were from my childhood, others were more recent. Panic started to set in. How the hell did these pictures get here? I moved into the living room, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing in the corner, shrouded in darkness. It was shaped like a minion from those kids' movies, but this one was twisted, grotesque. It had sharp teeth, and its eyes glowed a sinister red. It just stood there, staring at me. I tried to move my character, but the controls were unresponsive. The screen started to glitch, and the figure slowly started to move towards me. I could hear its footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoing through my headphones. My heart was pounding in my chest. I wanted to quit the game, but my mouse wouldn't move, and my keyboard was frozen. The figure got closer and closer, and the closer it got, the more I could see how horrifying it was. Its skin was torn and decayed, patches of yellow mixed with dark, rotting flesh. The eyes, those red glowing eyes, seemed to bore into my soul. Just as it was about to reach my character, the screen went black. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. The game seemed to have crashed. I sat there, staring at the black screen, trying to calm down. But then, my monitor flickered back to life, and a new message appeared. Round 1 complete. Round 2 begins now. My heart sank. I didn't want to play anymore, but the game wouldn't let me quit. The screen shifted again, this time to a different house. It looked older, more run down. The graphics were even more realistic, almost like looking through a window into a real place. I heard a voice, a low guttural whisper, coming through my headphones. It was speaking in a language I couldn't understand, but the tone was menacing. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. As I explored the new house, I started to notice things that made my blood run cold. There were items from my own apartment scattered around. My favorite mug, a t-shirt I wore to bed, even the exact same model of laptop I was playing on. It felt like the game was invading my real life. I entered a bedroom, and my heart nearly stopped. There on the bed was a body. It was me, or at least it looked like me. The body was twisted and mangled, the face frozen in a mask of terror. Blood was everywhere, staining the sheets, the walls, even the ceiling. I could almost smell the metallic tang of it. I backed out of the room, my hands shaking. The game felt so real, too real. I was about to force my computer to shut down when I heard a loud bang from my living room. My blood turned to ice. I wasn't playing with headphones, and that sound definitely came from inside my apartment. I slowly got up, my legs feeling like jelly. I crept towards the living room, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. As I peeked around the corner, I saw something that made me want to scream. There, standing in the middle of my living room, was the same twisted minion from the game. Its red eyes glowed as it stared directly at me. I froze, unable to move. The minion slowly lifted a hand and pointed at me, its mouth opening to reveal those sharp, grotesque teeth. It let out a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through my very bones. I don't remember much after that. The next thing I knew, I was waking up on my couch, my computer screen still on, the game still running. The message on the screen read, "Round 2 complete. Round 3 begins now." I wanted to shut it off, to smash my computer to pieces, but something stopped me. I don't know if it was fear, curiosity, or something else entirely, but I knew I had to see this through, to the end. I took a deep breath and clicked continue. As soon as I clicked continue, the game loaded a new environment, but this time it was different. I wasn't in a house anymore. Instead, I found myself in a forest. The trees were tall and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The sky was a dark, angry red, casting an eerie glow over everything. The sound of leaves rustling in the wind and distant, unidentifiable noises added to the unsettling atmosphere. My character had a flashlight now, but its beam was weak, barely illuminating the path ahead. I started walking, my footsteps crunching on the dead leaves and twigs scattered on the ground. As I moved deeper into the forest, I could feel a sense of dread growing inside me. The game's realism was unnerving. I could almost feel the cold wind against my skin and smell the damp earth. After what felt like an eternity of walking, I stumbled upon a small clearing. In the center was a decrepit old cabin. The windows were shattered, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. I had no choice but to enter. The moment I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me, causing me to jump. I tried to open it, but it was locked tight. There was no turning back. The inside of the cabin was even worse than the outside. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the floor was littered with debris and broken furniture. There were strange symbols carved into the walls, and dried bloodstains were everywhere. My flashlight flickered as I moved through the rooms, each one more horrifying than the last. In the back of the cabin, I found a staircase leading down to a basement. The steps creaked under my weight as I descended into the darkness. The basement was cold, damp, and completely dark, except for the weak beam of my flashlight. As I reached the bottom, I saw a figure hunched over in the corner, its back to me. The figure was rocking back and forth, muttering something incomprehensible. I tried to get a closer look, but as soon as I took a step forward, the figure whipped around to face me. It was another one of those twisted minions, but this one was different. Its face was more human-like, with hollow, empty eyes and a mouth that stretched impossibly wide. It let out a blood-curdling scream and lunged at me. I managed to dodge it and ran back up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The minion was right behind me, its heavy footsteps echoing in the confined space. I burst out of the cabin and into the forest, not daring to look back. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing in a heap on the forest floor. The game didn't let up. The screen pulsed red, and the sound of the minion's scream seemed to echo all around me. When I finally dared to look at the screen again, the minion was gone. I was back in the clearing, but the cabin had vanished. In its place was a small, worn-down gravestone. The name on the gravestone was mine. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read the inscription. Here lies a soul claimed by the minion's curse. I sat there staring at the screen in disbelief. How could this game know my name? My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. But before I could process anything, the screen went black again, and another message appeared. Round 3 complete. Final round begins now. I was beyond terrified, but something compelled me to keep going. I clicked continue, and the game loaded the final environment. This time, I was in a hospital. The lights flickered, and the halls were eerily silent. I could hear the faint hum of machinery and the distant sound of someone crying. As I made my way through the hospital, I noticed that the rooms were filled with grotesque, mutilated bodies. Some were strapped to beds, others were slumped over in chairs, their faces frozen in expressions of unimaginable pain. I felt sick to my stomach, but I couldn't stop. I had to see this through. In one of the rooms, I found a file with my name on it. I opened it, and inside were detailed notes about my life, my childhood, my family, even my darkest secrets. It felt like the game was peeling away the layers of my soul, exposing everything I had ever tried to hide. I continued down the hall, my hands shaking. At the end of the corridor, I found a door labeled operating room. I knew I had to go inside. The room was dark, except for a single spotlight illuminating an operating table. On the table was a body covered with a sheet. As I approached the table, I could see the outline of the body beneath the sheet. My heart was pounding in my ears as I reached out and pulled the sheet back. What I saw made my blood run cold. It was me, or rather my character, lying there, eyes wide open, mouth twisted in a silent scream. Before I could react, the lights flickered, and the twisted minion appeared at the foot of the table. It stared at me with those red glowing eyes, its mouth stretching into a hideous grin. The screen started to glitch, and the minion began to speak in that same low, guttural whisper from before. This time I could understand it. Your soul is mine. The screen went black, and my computer shut down. I sat there in the darkness, too terrified to move. I wanted to believe it was just a game, but everything felt so real. The sounds, the sights, the smells. It was like I had been transported into another world, a world where my deepest fears had come to life. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the minion's twisted face, heard its haunting whisper. The next morning, I found a strange mark on my arm, a symbol that matched the ones I had seen in the game. I tried to wash it off, but it wouldn't budge. I don't know what to do now. I feel like I'm being watched, like the game has somehow crossed over into my reality. I can't shake the feeling that the minion is still out there, waiting for me to let my guard down. The days following my encounter with the game were a blur of paranoia and sleepless nights. I could feel my sanity slipping away, replaced by a constant state of fear. I couldn't go to the police. What would I even tell them? That a cursed video game was haunting me? They'd think I was insane. I tried to resume my normal routine, but everything felt off. I started noticing things out of place in my apartment. Objects would move. Doors I knew I had closed would be open, and sometimes I'd hear faint whispers when I was alone. The mark on my arm itched constantly, a relentless reminder of the nightmare I couldn't escape. One evening, I decided to do some research. There had to be others who experienced this, right? I scoured the dark web, searching for any mention of the minion's curse. Most of what I found were just urban legends, stories told to scare people. But then, I stumbled upon a blog. It was written by someone named Alex, who claimed to have played the game. Alex's blog was a chilling account of his own experience. He described the same twisted minions, the same horrifying environments, and the same feeling of being watched. But his story ended abruptly. The last post was from 2 years ago, simply titled, "It's Here." I reached out to the email address he had listed, hoping for some answers. To my surprise, I received a reply a few hours later. The email was brief, but it contained an address and a time. Meet me at 53 Elm Street midnight. I didn't know what to expect, but I was desperate. That night, I drove to the address, a rundown old house on the outskirts of the town. The place looked abandoned, the windows boarded up, and the yard overgrown. I parked my car and made my way to the front door, my heart pounding in my chest. The door creaked open as I approached, revealing a dark, musty hallway. I stepped inside, calling out for Alex. There was no response, just the eerie silence. I ventured further into the house, the floorboards creaking under my weight. In the living room, I found a small table with a single candle burning on it. Next to the candle was a stack of papers. As I picked them up, I realized they were Alex's notes. He had been researching the game for years, trying to find a way to break the curse. His notes detailed the history of the game, tracing it back to ancient rituals and dark magic. According to Alex, the game was created as a way to summon and trap souls, feeding on their fear and despair. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around to see a man standing in the doorway. He looked gaunt, his eyes sunken and haunted. "You must be the one who emailed me," he said, his voice hoarse. "You're Alex?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He nodded. I've been waiting for someone else to find me. I thought I was alone in this. We talked for hours. Alex explained that the game was more than just a cursed piece of software. It was a portal to another dimension, a realm of nightmares. The twisted minions were the gatekeepers, and once you played the game, they could cross over into our world. He showed me the scars on his arms, similar to the mark I had. It's their mark, he said. Once you're marked, they can find you anywhere. He had been living in hiding, constantly on the move to avoid the minions, but he had a plan, a way to potentially break the curse. There was an old ritual described in his notes that could sever the connection between our world and the game's dimension. It was dangerous, but it was our only hope. We prepared for the ritual that night. It required a series of symbols drawn in a specific pattern and a chant in an ancient language. As we set everything up, I could feel the air growing colder, the atmosphere becoming oppressive. The house seemed to creak and groan around us, as if it were alive. We began the ritual at midnight. Alex chanted the incantation while I drew the symbols, my hands shaking with fear. The candle flickered violently, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. Suddenly, a loud crash came from the hallway, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. "They're here," Alex whispered, his voice trembling. I turned to see the twisted minions standing in the doorway, their red eyes glowing with malevolence. They moved slowly, deliberately, their grotesque forms twisting and contorting as they approached. Alex continued to chant, his voice growing louder and more desperate. The minions lunged at us, but as they crossed the threshold of the symbols, they seemed to hit an invisible barrier. They screamed in rage, their voices a cacophony of agony. The air grew thick with the smell of sulfur and decay. I could feel my skin crawling, my heart racing. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, there was a blinding flash of light. The minions let out a final, ear-piercing scream before disappearing into thin air. The house fell silent, the oppressive atmosphere lifting. I collapsed to the floor, exhausted and shaking. Alex slumped against the wall, breathing heavily. "It's done," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The connection is severed." I didn't know if I could believe him, but for the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of hope. We left the house together, not daring to look back. Alex promised to stay in touch, to make sure the curse was truly broken. It's been a week since that night. I haven't seen any more minions, and the mark on my arm has faded. I still feel uneasy, like I'm being watched, but I'm starting to believe that we succeeded. I can only hope that this nightmare is finally over. A month passed since the ritual, and I slowly started to believe that the nightmare was finally over. Life began to return to a semblance of normalcy. I went back to my job, tried to reconnect with friends, and even began to sleep without the constant fear of waking up to find those horrific minions in my apartment. However, something still felt off, like a dark cloud lingering just beyond the horizon. One evening, I received a frantic call from Alex. His voice was barely recognizable, filled with panic and fear. "They're back," he said, his words rushed and almost incoherent. "I don't know how, but they found me again." My heart sank. How could this be happening? We had performed the ritual. We had severed the connection, but it was clear from Alex's voice that the minions had somehow returned. He begged me to come to his new hiding place, a decrepit motel on the outskirts of the town. I drove there as fast as I could, the feeling of dread growing with each passing mile. When I arrived, the place looked abandoned, much like Alex's previous hideout. The neon sign flickered weakly, casting an eerie glow over the empty parking lot. I found Alex in one of the rooms, huddled in a corner, clutching a journal tightly to his chest. He looked worse than before, gaunt, with dark circles under his eyes and a wild look of desperation. "I've been researching more," he said, thrusting the journal into my hands. "The ritual wasn't enough. There's something we missed, something crucial." The journal contained pages upon pages of notes, drawings, and symbols. Alex had been diving deeper into the origins of the Minion's curse, uncovering dark secrets that should have remained buried. According to his research, the Minions were not just gatekeepers, but servants to something much darker, a malevolent entity that thrived on fear and suffering. Severing the connection had only temporarily weakened their hold. "We need to perform another ritual," Alex explained, his voice shaking. "A final one, to banish the entity itself. But it's dangerous, more dangerous than anything we've done before." As he spoke, the lights in the room began to flicker. A cold wind swept through the room, despite the windows being closed. The air grew thick, and an oppressive feeling settled over us. We knew we didn't have much time. The Minions were coming. We gathered the necessary items for the ritual: candles, chalk, herbs, and a ceremonial dagger. This time, the ritual required blood, both of ours. We had to offer a piece of ourselves to draw the entity out, to lure it into the open where we could banish it. We started the ritual just as the sun set, casting long shadows across the room. Alex drew the symbols on the floor with meticulous precision, while I lit the candles and prepared the herbs. The atmosphere grew heavier with each passing minute, the air thick with an almost tangible darkness. As we began chanting the incantation, the room grew colder, and the lights flickered more violently. The symbols on the floor started to glow faintly, pulsing with an eerie light. Alex handed me the dagger, and we each made a small cut on our palms, letting our blood drip onto the symbols. The moment our blood touched the floor, the room was filled with a deafening roar. The candles flickered wildly, and the shadows on the walls seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing like living entities. The Minions appeared, their red eyes glowing with a fierce intensity. But this time, they didn't attack. They stood at the edges of the room, watching us with an almost reverent silence. It was then that I realized they weren't our enemies. They were merely pawns, bound to the will of the true horror. From the center of the ritual circle, a dark figure began to materialize. It was a shapeless mass of darkness, its form constantly shifting and changing. The air grew colder still, and I could feel my breath freezing in my lungs. The entity's presence was overwhelming, a pure embodiment of terror. Alex's voice grew louder, more urgent, as he continued the incantation. I joined in, our voices merging into a desperate plea for salvation. The entity let out a low, guttural growl, its form pulsating with anger and hatred. The Minions began to move, circling us, their red eyes fixed on the entity. The ritual reached its climax. The symbols on the floor glowed brightly, and the entity let out a scream that seemed to shake the very foundations of the room. The Minions lunged forward, their forms dissolving into the darkness of the entity. The room was filled with a blinding light, and for a moment I thought we had succeeded. But then, everything went wrong. The light flickered and died, and the entity surged forward. knocking us both to the ground. The minions were gone, absorbed into the darkness, and the room was filled with a suffocating silence. I looked at Alex, his face pale with fear. "It's too strong," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "We can't banish it." The entity loomed over us, its form shifting and changing, an ever-present embodiment of our worst fears. I could feel its presence in my mind, probing, searching for my deepest insecurities. It fed on our fear, growing stronger with each passing second. In a final, desperate act, Alex grabbed the dagger and plunged it into his own chest, his blood spilling onto the symbols. "Run!" he screamed, his voice filled with agony. "Get out of here!" I wanted to stay, to help him, but the entity's presence was overwhelming. I stumbled to my feet and ran, the sound of Alex's screams echoing in my ears. I burst out of the motel room and into the night, not daring to look back. I drove aimlessly for hours, my mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. I didn't know where to go, what to do. The entity was still out there, and I could feel its presence, a constant gnawing dread in the back of my mind. As dawn broke, I found myself at a small roadside diner. I parked my car and stumbled inside, collapsing into a booth. The waitress gave me a concerned look, but I couldn't bring myself to explain. I just sat there, staring blankly at the table, trying to process everything that had happened. The entity was still out there, and now it knew who I was. I didn't know how long I could keep running, how long I could stay ahead of it. But I knew one thing for certain. The nightmare was far from over. I sat in the diner for what felt like hours, numb and exhausted. The realization that I couldn't run from this entity forever weighed heavily on me. I had to find a way to end this once and for all. Alex had sacrificed himself trying to banish it, and I couldn't let his death be in vain. I pulled out Alex's journal from my bag, flipping through the pages, looking for anything we might have missed. As I read through his notes, I noticed a passage that I had overlooked before. It spoke of a final confrontation, a way to face the entity directly and destroy it from within its own realm. It was a long shot, but it was the only hope I had left. According to Alex's notes, I needed to return to the origin point, the place where the game had first drawn me in. I had to re-enter the game and confront the entity on its own turf. The thought of going back into that hellish nightmare terrified me, but I knew it was the only way. That night, I returned to my apartment and booted up my computer. The game's icon still sat on my desktop, a grim reminder of the horror I had unleashed. I double-clicked it, and the familiar title screen appeared. My heart pounded in my chest as I clicked Start. The screen went black, and I found myself back in the forest, the twisted trees and dark sky exactly as I remembered. This time, there was no pretense of a game. I was here to face the entity, and it knew it. The oppressive atmosphere was even more intense, and I could feel its eyes on me, watching my every move. I made my way through the forest, following a path that seemed to guide me deeper into the darkness. The sounds of the forest were deafening, a cacophony of whispers and distant screams. I felt the entity's presence growing stronger, a cold, malevolent force that seemed to surround me. Eventually, I reached a clearing. In the center stood an ancient, crumbling altar, covered in strange symbols. This was the place. I stepped forward, feeling the ground tremble beneath my feet. The air grew colder, and the sky darkened, as if the very world were closing in on me. As I stood before the altar, the entity materialized. It was a towering, amorphous mass of darkness, its form constantly shifting and writhing. Its eyes, those terrible, glowing eyes, bore into me, filling me with an overwhelming sense of dread. "You dare to challenge me?" it hissed, its voice echoing in my mind. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "This ends now," I said, my voice trembling, but determined. The entity let out a roar, and the ground shook violently. Shadows erupted from the altar, swirling around me like a vortex of despair. I could feel the fear trying to take hold, but I fought against it, focusing on the symbols Alex had shown me. I began to chant, the ancient words spilling from my lips. The shadows recoiled, and the entity shrieked in rage. I could feel its power, its hatred, trying to crush me, but I pushed on, the words flowing faster, louder. The symbols on the altar glowed brightly, and the shadows began to dissolve. The entity let out a final, ear-piercing scream, its form disintegrating into nothingness. The ground stopped shaking, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by an eerie silence. I collapsed to the ground, exhausted but relieved. It was over. The entity was gone, its power broken. I had faced my worst fears and emerged victorious. As I lay there, the forest around me began to fade, the world of the game dissolving into darkness. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my apartment, the computer screen blank. I took a deep breath, the weight of the ordeal lifting from my shoulders. The mark on my arm had vanished, leaving only a faint scar. The minions were gone, and the entity had been destroyed. In the weeks that followed, I tried to return to a normal life. The nightmares still haunted me, but they grew less frequent with time. I kept Alex's journal as a reminder of the sacrifice he had made and of the battle we had fought together. I don't know if I'll ever fully recover from what happened, but I do know one thing: I survived. I faced the darkness and lived to tell the tale. The minion's curse was real, and it had nearly claimed me. But in the end, I fought back, and I won. I never touched the dark web again, and I stayed far away from any cursed games or haunted websites. Some things are better left alone, buried in the shadows where they belong. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that even in the darkest of times, there's always a way to fight back. And sometimes, just sometimes, you can win. I video called the cursed woman with the creepy smile on the dark web. I've always had a morbid curiosity, a need to explore the dark corners of the internet. My friends warned me, but the thrill of the unknown was too tempting. One night, I found myself diving deeper into the dark web. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just browsing through the eerie forums and cryptic sites. It was around 2 a.m. when I stumbled upon a thread titled, "The Cursed Woman with the Creepy Smile. Video call at your own risk." The thread had a lot of comments, mostly warning people to stay away, but a few claimed it was just an urban legend, a scare tactic. The more I read, the more intrigued I became. The post provided a link to a chat room. The instructions were clear. You had to be alone, in a dark room, and you had to keep your camera on. Ignoring the chill that ran down my spine, I set up my laptop in my bedroom, turned off the lights, and clicked the link. The screen went black for a moment. Then the chat room interface appeared. There were no other participants, just me. I waited, heart pounding in my chest. After what felt like an eternity, a notification popped up. The cursed woman has joined the chat. My screen flickered, and her image appeared. She was sitting in a dimly lit room, her face barely visible, but her smile, That smile was the first thing I noticed. It stretched unnaturally wide, as if her lips were being pulled by some unseen force. Her eyes were dark voids, and she stared directly into the camera, as if she could see right through the screen and into my soul. "Hello?" I said, my voice shaky. She didn't respond, just kept smiling. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. There was something profoundly wrong about her. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a video loop, a clever trick. But then she moved. Slowly, deliberately, she leaned closer to the camera. I could see the details of her face now. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her teeth were too perfect, too white. It was as if someone had sculpted her face to be unsettlingly perfect. "Who are you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She finally spoke, her voice a soft, chilling whisper. "Do you believe in curses?" I hesitated. "No, not really." Her smile widened, if that was even possible. "You should." Without warning, the lights in my room flickered and went out completely. My screen was the only source of light now, casting an eerie glow on my face. I felt a cold breeze, though all my windows were closed. Panic started to set in. "What's happening?" I demanded, my voice rising in fear. "You're mine now," she whispered. "The curse is real, and it's on you." Before I could react, my screen went black again. I frantically tried to turn the lights back on, but the switch wasn't working. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. The room was empty, just as I had left it, but something felt different, like a heavy presence was looming over me. I tried to shake off the feeling, convincing myself it was just a prank. I turned my laptop back on, but the chat room was gone. There was no trace of the woman or the conversation. I decided to call it a night and go to bed, hoping sleep would erase the memory of her terrifying smile. But sleep didn't come easily. I tossed and turned, haunted by the woman's face. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her smile, heard her whisper. The next morning, I woke up feeling exhausted, but I pushed the experience to the back of my mind and went about my day. It wasn't until I got home that I noticed something strange. There was a new picture on my phone. It was a selfie, taken in my room, but I didn't remember taking it. In the background, barely visible, was the woman with the creepy smile. She was standing right behind me. My blood ran cold. I deleted the photo, thinking it was some sort of glitch. But then, more photos appeared. Each one was closer, her smile growing wider, her eyes more menacing. I tried everything, resetting my phone, changing my locks, even sleeping with a knife under my pillow. But nothing helped. The photos kept coming, and I started to feel her presence more and more. It wasn't just the photos. Strange things began happening around the house. Objects moved on their own. Doors creaked open and shut, and I heard whispers at night. I was losing my mind, and I had no one to turn to. My friends would think I was crazy if I told them the truth. One night, I woke up to find her standing at the foot of my bed. Her smile was gone, replaced by a look of pure hatred. She reached out with a bony hand, and I felt a cold, sharp pain in my chest. I screamed and bolted upright, but she vanished as soon as I moved. The pain lingered, and I saw a deep scratch across my chest, as if made by long, sharp nails. I knew I couldn't stay in that house anymore. I packed a bag and left, not knowing where to go. I just needed to get away from her. But no matter where I went, she followed. Hotels, friends' houses, even random motels in the middle of nowhere. She always found me, always left those damn photos. Now, As I sit in this dingy motel room, I can feel her watching me. The room is cold and the lights are flickering again. My laptop is on, the chat room open. I can see her face, her smile filling the screen. She's here, and there's no escape. If you're reading this, take my advice. Stay away from the dark web and never ever video call the cursed woman with the creepy smile. Leaving my house didn't help. She was always there, lurking in the shadows, her presence growing stronger every day. I started hearing her voice even when my phone was off, whispering my name, promising that she would never let me go. I tried going to the police, but what could I tell them? That a ghost from a video call was haunting me? They looked at me like I was insane, and maybe I was. They took a report just to humor me, but I knew they couldn't help. I went back to my childhood home, hoping that being with my parents might keep her at bay. My mom noticed the bags under my eyes, the way I jumped at every sound. She asked if I was okay, but I couldn't tell her the truth. Instead, I lied, saying work was stressing me out. That night, I stayed in my old room. It was comforting, in a way, being surrounded by familiar things. But as I lay in bed, I felt that cold presence again. I didn't want to turn around, but I had to know. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, slowly sweeping the room. For a moment, everything was normal. Then I saw her. She was standing in the corner, her eyes reflecting the light from my phone. She wasn't smiling this time. Her face was twisted in anger, her eyes filled with a malice that made my blood run cold. She started moving towards me, her limbs jerking unnaturally. I screamed, and the light flickered out. When it came back on, she was gone. My parents burst into the room, finding me huddled in the corner, clutching my phone. I told them it was just a nightmare, but I knew they didn't believe me. They tried to comfort me, but nothing they said could erase the image of her face from my mind. The next day, I decided to dig deeper. I went back to the dark web, looking for answers. Maybe there was a way to break the curse, something I could do to get rid of her. I found more threads about the cursed woman, stories of others who had seen her. They all ended the same way. No one escaped her. The stories were eerily similar. The creepy smile, the whispers, the feeling of being watched. Some mentioned her becoming more violent over time, attacking them in their sleep, leaving marks that couldn't be explained. One post stood out. It was from someone who claimed to have found a way to communicate with her. They said she was a vengeful spirit, a woman who had been wronged in life and cursed to haunt those who summoned her. They provided an address, saying that visiting the place where she died might offer some answers. Desperation drove me to follow the lead. The address was a rundown house on the outskirts of the town, abandoned and overgrown with weeds. I broke in, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the floors creaked under my weight. I found a journal in one of the rooms, hidden under a loose floorboard. It belonged to a woman named Eliza. Her entries were filled with anger and sorrow, detailing a life of abuse and betrayal. The final pages spoke of a ritual, a desperate attempt to curse those who wronged her. She had succeeded, but at a terrible cost. She had bound herself to the curse, becoming the very thing she sought to control. As I read, I felt her presence growing stronger. I looked up, and there she was, standing in the doorway. This time, her smile was back, wider and more terrifying than ever. I tried to run, but she was faster. She grabbed my arm her touch icy and painful. I felt a surge of agony as her nails dug into my skin, leaving deep, bloody scratches. "You can't escape," she whispered, her breath cold against my ear. "You brought this upon yourself." I managed to break free, stumbling out of the house and into my car. I drove as fast as I could, not caring where I was going. I just needed to get away. But as I glanced in the rear-view mirror, I saw her sitting in the back seat, her eyes locked onto mine. I swerved, nearly crashing into a tree. When I looked back, she was gone. I pulled over, shaking and gasping for air. The scratches on my arm were still bleeding, and the pain was unbearable. I knew then that there was no escaping her. She would follow me to the ends of the earth, haunting me until I lost my mind, or worse. But I wasn't ready to give up. There had to be a way to break the curse, to free myself from her grip. The next few days were a blur of fear and desperation. I barely slept, constantly on edge, waiting for her next appearance. She was relentless, tormenting me day and night. I couldn't eat, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but wait for the inevitable. Then one night, I received an email. It was from an anonymous sender, but the subject line caught my attention. "I can help you." The message was short, offering a solution and a meeting place. I had nothing left to lose, so I decided to go. I arrived at the meeting place, a desolate park on the edge of the town, just before midnight. A figure emerged from the shadows, a man wearing a hooded cloak. He didn't say a word, just handed me a small old book. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed with age. "This will help," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "But it comes with a price." Before I could ask what he meant, he vanished into the darkness. I opened the book, flipping through its pages. It was filled with rituals, spells, and incantations. One page stood out, a ritual to banish vengeful spirits. It required a personal item from the spirit and a blood offering from the one seeking to break the curse. I knew what I had to do. I returned to the abandoned house, hoping to find something that belonged to Eliza. I found a locket hidden in a drawer, its chain broken, but the picture inside still intact. It was a photo of her, smiling, but not the creepy smile I had come to fear. This was a genuine smile, a glimpse of the woman she had once been. I followed the instructions in the book, setting up the ritual in the very room where I had found her journal. I placed the locket in the center, surrounded by candles, and cut my palm, letting my blood drip onto the locket. I recited the incantation, my voice trembling. At first, nothing happened. Then the room grew colder, and the candles flickered violently. I felt her presence, stronger than ever, and she appeared before me, her face contorted in rage. "Leave me alone," I shouted, my voice breaking. "I just want this to end." Her expression changed, and for a moment she looked almost sad. She stepped closer, and I braced myself for the worst. But instead of attacking, she reached out and touched the locket. The moment her fingers made contact, a blinding light filled the room, and she let out a blood-curdling scream. When the light faded, she was gone. The room was silent, the air still. I collapsed to the floor, exhausted and bleeding, but relieved. The curse was broken, or so I thought. In the days that followed, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in months. The scratches on my arm healed, and I started to feel like myself again. But then, the dreams began. Dreams of her, trapped in a dark place, screaming for help. Her face was no longer twisted in anger, but contorted in pain and fear. I realized then that the curse hadn't been broken, I had only managed to banish her to another realm, a place where she continued to suffer. And now, every night, I could hear her cries, begging me to set her free. I don't know what to do. I can't go back to that house, can't risk summoning her again, but I can't ignore her cries either. If you're reading this, please, learn from my mistakes. Curiosity can lead to places darker than you can imagine, and some curses are worse than death. And now, as I write this, I feel her presence again. The lights are flickering, and I can hear her whispering my name. She's back, and this time, I don't think I can escape. After those harrowing days of fleeting peace, I realized there was no escaping her torment. The nights became unbearable. Her cries were so vivid, they seemed to seep into my very soul. I couldn't sleep, eat, or think straight. Desperation took hold of me, pushing me to seek out anyone who might have answers. I reached out to paranormal experts, occultists, and anyone who had a reputation for dealing with the supernatural. Most of them dismissed me as a lunatic, but one person agreed to meet me. Her name was Margot, a reclusive woman known for her knowledge of ancient curses and dark magic. Margot's house was hidden deep in the woods, a decrepit shack surrounded by overgrown vegetation. She greeted me at the door, her eyes piercing and filled with an unsettling wisdom. Inside, her home was cluttered with old books, strange artifacts, and the smell of incense. "You've been cursed," she said, before I even explained my situation. "I can feel it. The spirit is bound to you, feeding on your fear." I nodded, unable to speak. The weight of my ordeal was crushing. "There is a way," Margot continued, her voice low, "but it requires great sacrifice." She explained that to truly free myself from the cursed woman, I had to perform a ritual that would sever our connection permanently. The ritual involved invoking a powerful entity to cleanse my soul, but it came with a severe price. I would have to offer a part of myself, something irreplaceable, to break the bond. "I'll do anything," I said, desperation clear in my voice. Margot nodded and handed me a list of items I needed to gather. Some were mundane, like candles and herbs, but others were more disturbing. A lock of my hair, a vial of my blood, and something that held great personal significance. I spent the next few days gathering the items, the cursed woman's presence growing stronger with each passing moment. She appeared more frequently, her face more twisted and grotesque. Her whispers became screams, echoing in my mind, leaving me on the brink of madness. Finally, I had everything I needed. Margot instructed me to perform the ritual at the place where the curse was born, the abandoned house. I arrived at dusk, the sun casting long shadows that seemed to dance menacingly around me. I set up the ritual in the same room where I had found Eliza's journal. The candles cast a flickering light, and the air was thick with tension. I placed the items in a circle, my hands trembling as I followed Margot's instructions. As I began chanting the incantation, the temperature dropped and the candles flickered wildly. I could feel her presence, stronger than ever. She appeared before me, her eyes blazing with fury, her mouth twisted into a snarl. "You think you can escape me?" she hissed. "You are mine!" I continued chanting, my voice shaking but determined. The room filled with a blinding light, and I felt a searing pain in my chest. It was as if my very soul was being torn apart. I screamed, the sound mingling with hers as the ritual reached its climax. And then, silence. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. The room was dark, the candles snuffed out. I felt a profound emptiness, a void where her presence had been. For a moment, I thought I had succeeded, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw her. She was different now, her form more solid, more real. Her eyes were filled with a sorrow that was almost tangible. She reached out to me, her touch no longer cold, but warm, almost human. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft and mournful. I was too stunned to speak. She started to fade, her body dissolving into the air. I felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow, as if I had lost a part of myself. When she was gone, the house felt empty, devoid of the oppressive presence that had haunted me for so long. I left the house, feeling lighter but haunted by what I had experienced. The ritual had worked, but at what cost? I had severed the bond, but I could still feel the lingering effects of the curse. The memories of her twisted smile, her haunting whispers, and the pain she inflicted on me were etched into my mind. Life slowly returned to some semblance of normalcy. I tried to move on, but the scars, both physical and mental, remained. I avoided the dark web, avoiding anything that might remind me of that night. But deep down, I knew I could never truly escape what had happened. One night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard a familiar whisper. My heart raced, and I bolted upright, searching the room for any sign of her. But there was nothing. Just my mind playing tricks on me, I told myself. Just a residual echo of the horror I had endured. But as the nights went on, the whispers grew louder, more persistent. They weren't her voice anymore, but a chorus of voices, each one filled with pain and sorrow. I realized with a sinking feeling that the curse hadn't been broken. It had evolved. The cursed woman might have been banished, but her legacy remained. The ritual had opened a door, and now I was connected to something far worse, something ancient and hungry, feeding on the darkness within me. Margot's words echoed in my mind. Great sacrifice. I had offered a part of myself, but it hadn't been enough. The darkness had taken root, and now it was spreading, infecting every aspect of my life. I don't know how much longer I can hold on. The whispers are growing louder, the shadows deeper. I fear that soon I will be consumed by the darkness, becoming just another victim of the cursed woman's legacy. If you're reading this, heed my warning. There are forces in this world that should never be tampered with. Curiosity may lead you down paths from which there is no return, and some curses are worse than death. The whispers became my constant companions, their insidious murmurings, a relentless reminder of the darkness that had infiltrated my life. I couldn't escape them, not during the day, and certainly not at night. They followed me everywhere, gnawing at my sanity, breaking down the walls of reality until I could no longer tell what was real and what was a figment of my tormented mind. I knew I had to do something, anything, to silence them. Margot had been my last hope, and although her ritual had severed the bond with the cursed woman, it had opened a floodgate to something far worse. I needed answers and fast, so I turned to the one place I had sworn never to return, the dark web. I posted my story on several forums, desperately seeking anyone who could help me. Days passed with no response, the silence only amplifying the whispers. Then finally, I received a message from someone named Erebus. Erebus claimed to be an expert in dark curses and ancient rituals, someone who had encountered similar cases before. We arranged a meeting in a public park, far from the prying eyes of my cursed home. Erebus was a tall, thin man with hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed to peer into the depths of my soul. "You've meddled with forces you can't comprehend," he said, his voice a harsh whisper. "But there might be a way to fix this. It's risky, and it will require another sacrifice." I nodded, willing to do anything to end this nightmare. Erebus explained that I needed to find an ancient artifact, something that had been used in rituals for centuries. It was a relic known as the Heart of Shadows, a stone said to hold the power to absorb dark energies. The catch? The relic was hidden in a catacomb beneath an old abandoned church on the outskirts of the town, a place rumored to be haunted by the souls of those who had died in agony. Erebus handed me a map and wished me luck, his expression grave. That night, I made my way to the church. It stood on a desolate hill, its spire reaching up like a skeletal finger towards the stormy sky. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the wind howled through the broken windows, creating an eerie symphony of despair. Inside the church was a ruin, its pews shattered, the altar covered in dust and cobwebs. I found the entrance to the catacombs behind a fallen statue, a gaping maw that led into the darkness below. I hesitated, fear gnawing at my resolve, but the whispers urged me on. The catacombs were a labyrinth of narrow passageways and damp, suffocating air. My flashlight flickered as I descended deeper, the walls closing in around me. The whispers grew louder, echoing off the stone, blending with the distant sounds of dripping water and the scurrying of unseen creatures. I followed the map, my heart pounding in my chest. The deeper I went, the colder it became, and I could feel the presence of the tormented souls that haunted this place. Finally, I reached a chamber, its walls lined with ancient runes and bones. In the center, on a pedestal, lay the Heart of Shadows. The stone was black, pulsating with a dark energy that seemed to draw me in. I reached out, my hand trembling, and as soon as I touched it, a surge of power shot through me. The whispers intensified, a cacophony of voices screaming in my mind. I collapsed to the floor, clutching the stone, as visions flooded my mind. I saw the cursed woman, Eliza, her life of suffering and betrayal, her desperate attempt to curse those who had wronged her. But I also saw something else, an entity, ancient and malevolent, feeding on the pain and suffering she had unleashed. This entity was the true source of the curse, using Eliza as a vessel to spread its darkness. And now it had latched onto me, drawing power from my fear and despair. I realized then that the Heart of Shadows was not a cure, but a trap, a way for the entity to consume me entirely. With a surge of adrenaline, I pushed myself to my feet, the whispers deafening. I had to find a way to use the stone to banish the entity without losing myself in the process. The runes on the walls seemed to shift and move, revealing a pattern, a ritual that might save me. I placed the stone on the pedestal, aligning it with the runes. I began to chant the incantation that had formed in my mind, the words foreign and ancient. The air around me grew colder, and the chamber shook as if the very foundations of the earth were rebelling against my actions. The entity's presence became palpable, a swirling vortex of darkness that threatened to engulf me. But I kept chanting, my voice rising above the cacophony of screams and whispers. The Heart of Shadows began to glow, absorbing the dark energy, its pulsations growing more frantic. Then with a final thunderous crash, the stone shattered. A blinding light filled the chamber, and the darkness was sucked into the void, leaving behind an eerie silence. I fell to my knees, exhausted but alive. The whispers were gone. The entity had been banished, and the curse lifted. I stumbled out of the catacombs, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon. I had survived, but the experience had changed me forever. As I left the church behind, I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. The dark web had opened a door to unimaginable horrors, and I knew that some doors, once opened, could never be fully closed. I would always carry the scars of my encounter with the cursed woman and the entity that had sought to consume me. And though I had freed myself from their grasp, the darkness was never far away. It lingered on the edges of my vision, a reminder of the thin veil that separates our world from the horrors that lie beyond. The weeks following my encounter with the Heart of Shadows were a blur. I moved through life like a ghost, the events of that night etched into my mind with painful clarity. The whispers had ceased, and the oppressive presence was gone, but the trauma lingered, casting a long, dark shadow over my existence. I returned to my apartment, hoping to find some semblance of normalcy, but the memories haunted me, especially at night. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights, sent my heart racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, lurking just out of sight. I tried to distract myself with work, friends, anything to keep my mind from drifting back to that cursed night. But the darkness had left a mark on me, one that no amount of distraction could erase. I avoided the dark web like the plague, terrified of what else might be lurking there, waiting to be discovered. One night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard a soft knock at my door. My heart skipped a beat. It was late, and I wasn't expecting anyone. I grabbed the knife I kept by my bed and cautiously approached the door. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. The knock came again, more insistent this time. I took a deep breath and opened the door, knife in hand. There was no one there, just the empty hallway. But as I was about to close the door, I noticed something on the floor. A small black envelope. My hands shook as I picked it up and tore it open. Inside was a single piece of paper with a message scrawled in blood-red ink. "It isn't over." A wave of dread washed over me. I scanned the hallway again, but there was no sign of anyone. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my mind racing. Who had left the note? Was it a cruel prank or something more sinister? I didn't sleep that night. The words, "It isn't over," echoed in my mind, feeding my paranoia. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound amplified by my fear. The next morning, I called Margot, desperate for answers. She listened patiently as I explained what had happened. "The darkness you encountered is ancient and powerful," she said. "Vanishing at once doesn't mean it's gone forever. It can find new ways to manifest, new ways to torment you." "What can I do?" I asked, my voice breaking. "There are protective rituals, ways to shield yourself," Margot replied. "But they require constant vigilance. You must be prepared for anything." She gave me instructions for a protection ritual, and I followed them meticulously, hoping to keep the darkness at bay. But deep down, I knew that I was forever changed. The encounter with the cursed woman and the entity had opened my eyes to a world beyond comprehension, a world where nightmares were real and the thin veil of reality could be torn apart with a single wrong move. Months passed, and the initial terror began to fade, replaced by a dull, constant anxiety. I became hyper-vigilant, always looking over my shoulder, always questioning every small, odd occurrence. I cut ties with people who didn't understand, isolating myself in a desperate attempt to protect them from the darkness that had touched my life. Then one night, I heard it again, a whisper. My blood ran cold as I realized it was coming from my laptop. The screen flickered to life, and there she was, the cursed woman, her smile more twisted and malevolent than ever. "You thought you could escape," she hissed, her voice dripping with malice. "But you belong to me. Now." The screen went black, and I felt a sharp pain in my chest, the same searing agony I had felt during the first encounter. I fell to the floor, gasping for breath, as the room filled with an oppressive darkness. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, filling my mind with their malevolent chorus. I realized then that the entity had never truly left. It had merely retreated, biding its time, growing stronger, and now it was back, more powerful than ever, feeding on my fear and despair. In my desperation, I reached out to Erebus again, pleading for help. He responded quickly, arranging a meeting in the same park. When I arrived, he looked at me with pity. "You can't run from this," he said. "The darkness has marked you. The only way to truly escape is to embrace it, to become one with it." His words filled me with a cold dread. I realized that there was no escaping the curse, no banishing the entity for good. It was a part of me now, an indelible stain on my soul. Erebus handed me another book, this one filled with darker, more sinister rituals. "This is your only hope," he said, "but be warned, the price is steep." I took the book, feeling the weight of my decision. I had no other choice. The darkness would consume me if I didn't act. I returned home and began preparing for the final ritual, knowing that it would either save me or damn me forever. As I set up the ritual, the whispers grew louder, more frenzied. The room grew colder, and I felt the entity's presence closing in. I began the incantation, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at my insides. The ritual was complex, requiring me to draw symbols in my own blood, to chant in a language long forgotten. The air crackled with dark energy, and I felt the entity's fury as it fought against the binding spell. As I reached the final part of the ritual, a blinding light filled the room, and the whispers reached a deafening crescendo. I screamed, pouring all my will into the incantation, forcing the darkness back. Then with a final, shattering scream, the light vanished, and the room fell silent. I collapsed to the floor, exhausted and covered in blood. The entity was gone, banished to whatever hell it had come from. But I knew I was forever changed. The whispers were gone, but the darkness remained, a constant reminder of the horrors I had faced. I knew that I would never be free, not truly. The curse had marked me, and I would carry its shadow for the rest of my life. I left my apartment, disappearing into the night, a wanderer haunted by the specters of my past. I vowed to use my knowledge to help others, to protect them from the darkness that lurks just beyond the veil of our reality. But deep down, I knew the truth. The darkness had claimed a part of me, and I would never be the same. The cursed woman and the entity had left their mark, a scar that would never heal. And as I walked away from my old life, I could still hear the faintest whisper in the back of my mind, a reminder that the darkness is always waiting, just out of sight, ready to claim its next victim. I bought old scary picture of my grandma on the dark web. After I showed her, I didn't expect her reaction. I never thought I'd find myself browsing the dark web. Honestly, I don't even know what got into me. It started as a harmless curiosity, just a way to kill time. You hear all these horror stories about the dark web, but it's like watching a car crash. You can't look away. One night, I was deep in those shady corners, scrolling through creepy listings that ranged from the bizarre to the outright illegal. That's when I found it. The listing was titled Vintage Family Photo Guaranteed Authentic. There was only one image, a black and white photo of a woman who looked eerily familiar. I clicked on it, and a shiver ran down my spine. The woman in the picture looked exactly like my grandma, but younger, way younger. My grandma was in her 80s, and this photo looked like it was from the 1940s or 50s. The resemblance was uncanny. I should have closed the browser and moved on, but something about that photo tugged at me. I couldn't explain it, but I felt compelled to buy it. The price was steep, way more than I should have spent on something so ridiculous, but I couldn't resist. I wanted to show it to my grandma and hear the story behind it. A few days later, the photo arrived. It was even creepier in person. The woman's eyes seemed to follow you, and there was something off about her smile. It wasn't a happy smile. It was more like a smirk, almost sinister. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up every time I looked at it. I decided to visit my grandma that weekend. She lives alone in an old house on the outskirts of the town. It's the kind of place that creaks and groans at night, adding to the already eerie atmosphere. When I arrived, she greeted me with her usual warmth, but something about her seemed different that day. She looked more tired, almost weary. After some small talk, I pulled out the photo. "Grandma, I found this online and thought it looked just like you," I said, handing it to her. As soon as she saw it, her face went pale. She snatched the photo from my hand and stared at it, her eyes wide with fear. "Where did you get this?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "Online," I replied, taken aback by her reaction. "Why? Is something wrong?" She didn't answer. Instead, she got up and walked over to the fireplace, throwing the photo into the flames. I watched in shock as it curled and blackened, the image of the woman distorting, before disappearing altogether. "Grandma, what the hell?" I shouted. "What's going on?" She turned to me, her eyes filled with tears. "You shouldn't have brought that here," she said, her voice breaking. "That's not just a picture. It's a curse." I laughed nervously, not sure if she was joking. "A curse? What are you talking about?" She sat down heavily in her chair, her hands trembling. "That woman, she's not me. She looks like me, but she's not. She's something evil, something dark. My family has been haunted by her for generations. We call her the doppelganger. She appears in photos and brings death and misery to anyone who sees her." I felt a chill run down my spine. This sounded like something out of a horror movie. "Come on, Grandma. You don't really believe that, do you?" Her expression hardened. "Believe what you want, but I've seen what she can do. My mother, my grandmother, and her mother before her, they all saw her, and they all suffered horrible fates. You need to be careful." I left her house that night, feeling uneasy. Part of me wanted to dismiss her story as just a scary tale, but another part couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept hearing noises in my apartment, creaks, whispers, things moving when they shouldn't be. The next morning, I woke up to find scratches on my bedroom door, like something had been clawing at it. My phone rang. and I nearly jumped out of my skin. It was Grandma. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice urgent. "Yeah, just a rough night," I replied, glancing at the door. There were some weird noises, and I found scratches on my door. She sighed deeply. "It's starting. You need to find a way to get rid of her, or it's only going to get worse." I spent the rest of the day researching curses and how to break them. Everything I found was either vague or completely unhelpful. That night, I tried to sleep again, but it was even worse than before. I woke up in the middle of the night to find the air in my room freezing cold. I could see my breath, and there was a figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was the woman from the photo. She just stood there, staring at me with those cold, dead eyes. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I felt like I was paralyzed. She started to smile, that same sinister smirk from the photo, and I felt a wave of terror wash over me. Then she was gone. I don't know how long I lay there, frozen in fear. Eventually, I managed to move and turned on every light in my apartment. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I called Grandma again, desperate for help. "Grandma, she was here," I whispered, my voice shaking. She was in my room. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "You need to come back here," she finally said. "There's something I need to show you." I packed a bag and drove back to her house as fast as I could. When I arrived, she was waiting for me, looking more frail than ever. She led me to the basement, a place I'd always found creepy. It was dark and musty, filled with old family relics and dusty furniture. In the corner, covered by a heavy cloth, was an old mirror. She pulled the cloth away, revealing a large, ornate frame. The mirror itself was cracked and dirty, but I could still see my reflection. "This mirror is the key," she said. "It's been passed down through our family, used to trap her, but it only works if you can get her to look into it." I stared at the mirror, feeling a mix of hope and dread. "How do we do that?" She looked at me with sad eyes. "We have to lure her in, make her think she's won." I didn't like the sound of that, but I was desperate. We spent the next few hours preparing. We set the mirror up in my bedroom, hiding it behind a curtain. Grandma gave me a small vial of some kind of liquid and told me to pour it around the room before I went to bed. That night, I followed her instructions to the letter. I poured the liquid, which smelled like a mix of herbs and something metallic, around the room and tried to calm my nerves. I climbed into bed, praying that this would work. Hours passed and nothing happened. I started to think maybe it was all just a bad dream, that maybe I was overreacting. Then the temperature dropped, and I knew she was back. She appeared at the foot of my bed, just like before. This time, I was ready. I grabbed the curtain and yanked it away, revealing the mirror. She turned to look at it, and for a moment, I thought it wasn't going to work. But then, her reflection in the mirror started to twist and distort. She screamed, a horrible, ear-piercing scream that made my blood run cold. I watched as her image was sucked into the mirror, leaving nothing but the cracked glass behind. I collapsed onto the bed, exhausted and terrified, but relieved. It was over, or so I thought. I barely slept that night, even though the doppelganger was gone. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind outside, set my nerves on edge. By morning, I was a wreck. I went to check on my grandma, finding her in the kitchen, sipping her morning tea with a solemn expression. "Did it work?" I asked, my voice hoarse from lack of sleep. She nodded slowly. For now, but she might not be gone for good. We need to be vigilant. Her words did little to ease my anxiety. I decided to stay with her for a few days, hoping that the comfort of her presence would help. But those days were anything but comforting. Every night I felt like I was being watched. Shadows seemed to move on their own, and strange noises echoed through the house. It was as if the house itself was alive, breathing, and watching me. One afternoon, while rummaging through the attic, I found an old trunk. It was covered in dust and cobwebs, and the lock was rusted shut. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pried it open. Inside were old family documents, letters, and photos. Among them, I found a diary belonging to my great-grandmother. I started reading, and what I found chilled me to the bone. The diary detailed encounters with the doppelganger, dating back generations. Each entry was more disturbing than the last. My great-grandmother described seeing the woman in mirrors, hearing her voice whispering in the dark, and finding her image in family photos. The doppelganger was relentless, always finding a way to return, no matter what they did to banish her. One entry stood out. It was dated shortly before my great-grandmother's death. She wrote about a ritual, a last-ditch effort to trap the doppelganger for good. It involved a mirror, blood, and a personal item from the doppelganger's chosen victim. The ritual was dangerous and could backfire if not performed correctly. I brought the diary to my grandma, who paled as she read it. "This is our only hope," she said, her voice trembling. "We have to perform the ritual." That night, we prepared. We found an old mirror in the basement, cleaned it, and set it up in the living room. Grandma pricked her finger and let a few drops of blood fall onto the mirror's surface. I placed the photo I had bought on the floor in front of it. We recited the incantation from the diary, our voices barely above a whisper. The air grew cold and the lights flickered. A sense of dread washed over me, making it hard to breathe. Suddenly, the mirror began to glow, and the image of the doppelganger appeared. She looked angrier than ever, her eyes burning with hatred. Grandma continued chanting, her voice growing stronger despite the fear in her eyes. The doppelganger's image started to distort, just like it had before. But this time, something went wrong. The mirror cracked, and a blast of cold air knocked us both to the ground. When I looked up, the doppelganger was standing in front of us, no longer confined to the mirror. She reached out with one skeletal hand, her fingers long and claw-like. I felt an icy grip around my throat, choking the life out of me. Grandma screamed, throwing herself at the doppelganger, but was tossed aside like a rag doll. I struggled to breathe, my vision going dark. In a last desperate effort, I grabbed the photo from the floor and held it up. The doppelganger's eyes locked onto it, and for a moment she hesitated. Taking advantage of her distraction, I shoved the photo into the mirror's frame. The mirror shattered, and with it, the doppelganger let out a blood-curdling scream before vanishing into thin air. I collapsed, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. Grandma crawled over to me, tears streaming down her face. "It's over," she whispered, hugging me tightly. "It's finally over." But the relief was short-lived. The next morning, I woke up to find the house eerily quiet. I called out for my grandma, but got no response. Panicking, I searched the house, only to find her lying on the floor of the living room, her eyes wide open, lifeless. The paramedics said it was a heart attack, but I knew better. The doppelganger had taken her, just like she had taken so many others before. I was left alone, with no one to turn to, and a crushing sense of guilt and fear that I would be next. In the weeks that followed, strange things started happening again. I found scratches on my doors, heard whispers in the night, and saw shadows that didn't belong. The doppelganger wasn't gone. She was still here, lurking, waiting. Desperate, I turned to the dark web again, searching for answers, for anything that could help. I found forums, chat rooms, and websites dedicated to the paranormal. Some people offered advice, while others dismissed my story as a hoax. But one message stood out. It was from someone who claimed to have faced the doppelganger and survived. Their advice was simple, but chilling. You can't escape her. The only way to be free is to pass the curse onto someone else. Find another photo and the cycle will continue. It's the only way. I sat in my darkened apartment, staring at the message. The thought of condemning someone else to this nightmare made me sick. But what choice did I have? The doppelganger would never stop, and I was running out of time. With a heavy heart, I made a decision. I found another photo online, one that looked eerily similar to a picture of a friend. I bought it, knowing that I was dooming them to the same fate. It was a cruel, desperate act, but it was the only way to save myself. When the photo arrived, I felt a deep sense of dread. I knew what I had to do, but the guilt was overwhelming. I invited my friend over, pretending it was just a casual get-together. When they arrived, I showed them the photo, watching their reaction closely. Their eyes widened, and a chill ran down my spine. The cycle had begun again. The decision to show my friend the photo haunted me long after they left. I watched them walk out of my apartment, completely unaware of the horror I had just unleashed upon them. The guilt was unbearable, but my fear for my own life had overridden my conscience. That night, I sat in my dark living room, the weight of what I had done pressing down on me. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside made me jump. The silence was suffocating, filled with the echoes of my own thoughts. I wondered if the doppelganger was already at my friend's place, if they were experiencing the same terror I had. A few days passed with no word from my friend. I tried calling and texting, but there was no response. My anxiety grew, and I began to fear the worst. The doppelganger was relentless, and I knew she wouldn't stop until her new victim was completely consumed. One evening, just as I was about to lose hope, my phone rang. It was my friend. Relief washed over me as I answered, but their voice on the other end was strained and panicked. "Hey, I need to talk to you," they said, their voice trembling. "Something weird has been happening. Can I come over?" My stomach dropped, but I tried to sound calm. "Of course. Come over whenever you want." When they arrived, they looked exhausted, with dark circles under their eyes and a haunted expression on their face. They sat down on my couch, clutching a cup of coffee like it was a lifeline. "Ever since you showed me that photo," they began, their voice barely above a whisper, "I've been seeing things. At first, it was just in the corner of my eye, shadows, movements. But last night, I saw her. My heart pounded in my chest." "What happened?" They took a deep breath, their hands shaking. "I woke up in the middle of the night. My room was freezing cold, and I saw her standing at the foot of my bed. She looked just like me, but her eyes, they were empty, like black holes. She just stared at me, and I couldn't move. I felt like I was being suffocated. I nodded, understanding exactly what they were describing. Did she say anything? Do anything? My friends shook their head. No, she just stood there. Then she disappeared. But I can still feel her presence, like she's watching me. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. There's something I need to tell you. That photo, it's cursed. The woman in it is a doppelganger, and she's been haunting my family for generations. I thought I could pass the curse on to someone else, but I didn't realize how dangerous it would be. Their eyes widened in shock and betrayal. You knew, and you still showed me the photo? Guilt washed over me, but I couldn't lie. I was desperate. She was going to kill me if I didn't do something. I'm so sorry. I didn't know what else to do. My friend stood up, their face pale with anger. You should have told me. Maybe we could have found another way. Before I could respond, they stormed out of my apartment, leaving me alone with my guilt and fear. I knew I had made a terrible mistake, but there was no turning back now. The doppelganger was out there, and she would stop at nothing to claim her next victim. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to hide a pair of eyes, every noise a whisper of something sinister. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. I was consumed by paranoia and guilt, constantly checking my phone for any word from my friend. One night, I woke up to the sound of my phone ringing. I glanced at the clock. It was 3 a.m. My heart raced as I answered, expecting the worst. It's me, my friend's voice came through, shaky and barely audible. I need your help. She's here. I jumped out of bed, throwing on my clothes and grabbing my keys. I'm on my way. Just hang on. I drove through the dark, deserted streets, my mind racing. When I arrived at their apartment, I found the door ajar. I pushed it open, my heart pounding in my chest. The place was a mess, furniture overturned, and broken glass scattered across the floor. Hello? I called out, my voice echoing in the silence. I heard a faint whimper from the bedroom. I rushed in to find my friend curled up in the corner, their face pale and eyes wide with terror. They pointed a trembling finger at the mirror on the wall. She's in there, they whispered. She's trapped in the mirror. I looked at the mirror, seeing the doppelganger's twisted, angry face staring back at me. Her eyes were filled with hatred, and her mouth was moving, as if she was screaming silently. We need to finish the ritual, I said, my voice shaking. It's the only way to trap her for good. My friend nodded, and together we retrieved the diary from my car. We followed the instructions carefully, lighting candles around the mirror and reciting the incantation. The room grew colder, and the air seemed to thicken, making it hard to breathe. As we chanted, the doppelganger's image began to twist and contort, her face becoming more monstrous by the second. She let out a silent scream, and the mirror started to crack, just like before. But this time, we were ready. I took the vial of blood Grandma had given me and poured it onto the mirror. The cracks began to glow, and the doppelganger's image was sucked into the center of the glass. With a final, piercing scream, she disappeared, and the mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces. We both collapsed to the floor, exhausted and relieved. It was finally over. The doppelganger was gone, and we were free. Or so we thought, as we sat there, catching our breath. A chill ran down my spine. I looked around, feeling like we were being watched. My friend noticed it too, their eyes widening in fear. "Do you feel that?" they whispered. Before I could respond, The room plunged into darkness. The candles blew out, and the air grew icy cold. I felt a presence behind me, and when I turned, I saw her, standing there, more real than ever before. The doppelganger had returned. The darkness was suffocating, wrapping around us like a heavy shroud. The doppelganger stood there, her eyes gleaming with malevolent triumph. Her presence was more palpable than ever, and the air seemed to vibrate with her malice. My friend and I scrambled to our feet, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. The doppelganger's eyes bore into mine, and I felt an icy grip of fear tightening around my heart. We had failed. The ritual hadn't worked, and now she was free, more powerful than ever. "We need to get out of here," my friend whispered, their voice trembling. I nodded, but as we moved towards the door, the doppelganger raised her hand. The door slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. We were trapped. Panic surged through me. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out. The diary. There had to be something we missed, some detail that could help us. I grabbed it from the floor and flipped through the pages, my hands shaking. The doppelganger stepped closer, her smile widening. The air around her seemed to distort, like heat waves rising from asphalt. She was a living nightmare, a manifestation of pure evil. "Here," my friend pointed to a passage in the diary, their finger trembling. "It says we need a personal item from her victim, something she has touched." I looked around frantically. The photo. It was the key. I grabbed it from the floor where it had fallen during the struggle. The edges were charred from the mirror's destruction, but it was still intact. Holding the photo in front of me, I began to recite the incantation again. The doppelganger's smile faltered, and she let out a low, guttural growl. The temperature in the room dropped even further, and I could see my breath in the air. The photo began to glow with a faint, eerie light. The doppelganger took a step back, her eyes narrowing with rage. My friend joined in, their voice adding strength to the incantation. Together, we chanted, pouring every ounce of our fear and desperation into the words. The light from the photo grew brighter, and the doppelganger screamed, a sound that pierced my ears and rattled my bones. She lunged at us, but an invisible force seemed to hold her back. Her form flickered, like a TV struggling to maintain a signal. "Keep going," I shouted, my voice raw with terror. The photo was now glowing so brightly that it hurt to look at. The doppelganger's image began to distort, her form twisting and writhing. Her screams grew louder, filled with a mix of rage and agony. With a final, desperate push, we shouted the last words of the incantation. The photo exploded in a blinding flash of light, and the doppelganger was sucked into it, her form collapsing in on itself like a black hole. The light dimmed, and the room fell into an eerie silence. We collapsed to the floor, exhausted and trembling. The air felt lighter. The oppressive weight of the doppelganger's presence finally lifted. We had done it. She was gone, but the victory felt hollow. The cost of our actions weighed heavily on us. My friend looked at me, their eyes filled with a mix of relief and sadness. "We need to destroy this," they said, holding up the remnants of the photo. "We can't risk her coming back." I nodded in agreement. Together, we gathered the pieces of the photo and the shattered mirror, taking them outside. We built a small fire in the backyard, and one by one, we tossed the fragments into the flames. The fire crackled and hissed, the remnants of the doppelganger's curse, turning to ash. As the last piece burned away, a sense of peace washed over me. The nightmare was finally over. We stood there in silence, watching the fire die down to embers. There was nothing left of the photo, the mirror, or the doppelganger. My friend and I hugged, a silent acknowledgement of the ordeal we had survived. We knew that we would never be the same, that the terror we had faced would haunt us for the rest of our lives. But at least we were free, or so we hoped. That night, I returned to my apartment, exhausted but hopeful. I climbed into bed, feeling a sense of relief for the first time in weeks. I drifted off to sleep, my dreams free of the doppelganger's haunting presence. But in the early hours of the morning, I was jolted awake by a cold, suffocating presence. My heart raced as I looked around, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. There, standing at the foot of my bed, was my friend. But something was wrong. Their eyes were empty, lifeless, and a sinister smile played on their lips. "Thank you," they whispered, their voice a chilling echo. "You set me free." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The doppelganger had found a new host. The nightmare was far from over. The realization that the doppelganger had possessed my friend paralyzed me with fear. Their empty, lifeless eyes and the sinister smile on their face were more terrifying than anything I had ever seen. My friend was gone, replaced by the malevolent entity we had tried so desperately to destroy. I scrambled out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The doppelganger, wearing my friend's form, took a step closer. "I want what I've always wanted," it said in that chilling, echoing voice. "To spread my curse, to feed on fear and despair. You thought you could get rid of me, but you only made me stronger." Desperation clawed at my mind. I had to find a way to save my friend, to end this nightmare once and for all. I remembered the diary, the incantations, and the mirror. There had to be something we missed, some final step we hadn't completed. I grabbed the diary from my bedside table and flipped through the pages, my hands trembling. The doppelganger watched me with a mocking smile, clearly enjoying my panic. As I scanned the entries, I found a passage we had overlooked. It described a final confrontation, a way to banish the doppelganger forever by confronting it directly in its own realm. The instructions were vague and filled with warnings. It required a deep state of meditation and a personal connection to the doppelganger's victim, in this case, my friend. It was risky, but it was our only hope. I looked up at the doppelganger, trying to muster the courage I needed. "I'm going to save my friend," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "And I'm going to end you." The doppelganger laughed, a sound that sent chills down my spine. "You can try, but you'll fail, just like all the others before you." Ignoring its taunts, I sat on the floor, closed my eyes, and began to focus. I pictured my friend, their real self, not the twisted version standing before me. I concentrated on our memories, our bond, hoping it would be enough to pull them back from the brink. The air grew colder, and the darkness around me seemed to deepen. I felt a pull, like I was being drawn into another world. I opened my eyes to find myself in a twisted, nightmarish version of my apartment. The walls were decayed, the air thick with a sense of dread. Standing in the center of the room was the doppelganger, but it no longer wore my friend's face. Instead, it was a shadowy, grotesque figure with empty eyes and a wide, menacing grin. "Welcome to my realm," it hissed. "Are you ready to die?" I stood my ground, feeling the weight of the diary in my hand. "I'm here to end this," I said firmly. I'm here to save my friend. The doppelganger lunged at me, moving with unnatural speed. I dodged, barely escaping its grasp. I began to recite the final incantation from the diary, my voice echoing through the twisted realm. The words felt powerful, resonating with an ancient energy. The doppelganger shrieked, its form flickering and distorting. It tried to attack again, but I held my ground, continuing the chant. The air crackled with energy, and the ground beneath us began to tremble. With a final, desperate scream, the doppelganger's form shattered into 1,000 pieces, dissolving into the darkness. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by a sense of calm and peace. I collapsed to the floor, exhausted but relieved. The nightmare was finally over. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my apartment. My friend was lying on the floor, unconscious but alive. I rushed to their side, shaking them gently. "Wake up," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "It's over. You're safe." They stirred, opening their eyes slowly. "What happened?" they asked, confusion and fear mingling in their gaze. I hugged them tightly, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. "It's a long story," I said, my voice choked with emotion. "But we're safe now. The doppelganger is gone." In the days that followed, my friend and I tried to return to a semblance of normalcy. The memory of the doppelganger lingered, but we took comfort in knowing we had faced it and won. The diary, now filled with our family's dark history and our own battle, was locked away, a reminder of the nightmare we had survived. But sometimes, late at night, I still feel a chill in the air, a reminder that the darkness is never truly gone. And I wonder if somewhere out there, the doppelganger is waiting, biding its time, ready to return. For now, though, we live our lives grateful for the peace we have earned, always vigilant and always together.